Welcome to Archive Whispers, a place to fall asleep. Settle in, lower the lights, and let the archive open.
Tonight, a small farmstead somewhere in the Old North, in the weeks when the summer has finally loosened its hold and the year begins its slow turn toward the dark. A cluster of low turf-roofed buildings beside a gray northern water, where ordinary people put their world in order before the snow. The first sign was always in the light. Through the long weeks of summer in the north, the sun had barely left the sky, and the people had worked and rested and worked again in a kind of endless pale gold dimness. But now, each evening, the dark came back a little earlier and stayed a little longer. Until one day someone standing in the yard noticed that the shadow of the gable had crept to a stone it had not reached since the spring. They kept no clocks and had no need of them. Time was read off the land itself, the notch in a particular hill where the sun rose, the rock on the headland above which it stood at the middle of the day, the worn marks that told a household when to rise and when to bring the cattle home. As the season slid toward winter, those marks shifted along the horizon, and the people read in them, without words, that the working light was draining slowly out of the year. With the shortening days came the wind. It had been there all summer, of course, a soft thing that moved the grass and dried the hay, but now it changed its character, swinging round to come off the open water with a gray weight behind it. It found the gaps in the turf walls and the seams of the roof, and at night it leaned on the whole long hall and made the timbers speak quietly to one another, so that even half asleep the household could feel the year leaning slowly in against them. One morning there would be frost. Not the killing frost of the deep winter, only a thin silver breath laid over the home field and the thatch and the backs of the sheep, gone an hour after the sun had touched it. But it was a message, and everyone understood it. The grass would not grow again now until the spring. Whatever the animals were to eat through the dark months was already cut, or else still standing in the field, and it would not get any larger. The North did not divide its year into 4 seasons as we do, but into 2 great halves, a summer and a winter. And the hinge between them fell now, in the stretch of evenings the people called the winter nights. It was a threshold more than a fixed day, a span of darkening evenings when the old half of the year was understood to be closing and the new dark half not yet quite begun, and the whole rhythm of the farm bent itself toward being ready before it came. There was no panic in any of this, and no drama. It was a feeling more like the slow closing of a hand, the household quietly drawing its scattered summer life back in toward the hearth. The sheeling up in the high pastures, where the young people had spent the warm months with the milking herds, was emptied and shuttered. The boats that had ranged out along the coast were thinking of home. Everything that had spread outward through the summer began, without hurry, to come back in. At the center of it all stood the woman of the house. The farm out of doors might belong to the men, but the indoors, the stores and the dairy and the long discipline of making a summer's plenty stretch all the way to spring was hers, and she carried the proof of it at her belt, a ring of iron keys, to the chests and the storehouse and the locked places where the most precious things were kept. In the autumn, her quiet authority came fully into its season. And so, before anything else, there was a reckoning. The household walked among its animals and its grain and made, in their heads, a hard and ancient sum. So much hay up in the loft, so much straw, so many mouths waiting in the byre, and the answer almost every year was that there was not quite enough to keep them all. Some of the herd would have to go before the snow, and the only questions were which and how many, and the family weighed it slowly, because the wrong answer meant hunger in the spring. The men climbed into the lofts and turned the hay, feeling it for damp, judging its weight against the winter still to come. Hay was the true wealth of a northern farm, worth more than silver, because silver could not be eaten by a cow in the dead of the winter. A wet summer that had spoiled the hay could empty a byre as surely as any disaster. A good one meant the cattle would come out thin but living when the grass at last returned. They counted it now, armful by armful, and tried to be honest about what it would bear. The children were handed the small, endless tasks that fill the edges of such weeks. Gathering windfalls under the crabapple trees, carrying water, driving the geese back from the shore, picking over the last of the beans. They did not yet feel the weight their parents carried, the long arithmetic of survival. For them, the autumn was only a change in the games, a colder wind to run in, the smell of smoke and salt that meant the grown world was busy and would not trouble them very much. In the evenings, when the work was set down and the door drawn shut against the wind, the hall filled with the low red light of the hearth and the smell of the day's labor still on everyone's hands. Outside, the cold pressed against the turf and the dark came down over the fjord. Inside, for a little while, there was warmth and food and the slow murmur of voices, and the great work of the season seemed, briefly, like something that might after all be managed. But the warmth was earned, and earned again each day, and the first and largest of the season's labors was waiting out in the field where the barley still stood. So it is there that we will go first, in the thin gray light of an autumn morning, to bring in the grain that was, more than anything else, the difference between a winter lived through and a winter merely survived. Come out into the cold with them now, and we will begin. They went out to the barley in the cold before the day had properly come, while the dew, or in the later weeks the frost, still lay heavy on the heads. The whole household went, everyone old enough to hold a tool, because the grain harvest could not wait upon anyone's convenience. A field of ripe barley stays patient for only a little while. Let it stand too long, or let one hard rain beat it down, and the heads shatter and a whole year's bread is left lying wasted in the mud. The tool of the harvest was the sickle, a short curved blade of iron set into a worn wooden handle, kept keen on a stone and dark with the oil of many hands. A reaper took a fistful of standing stalks in one hand, swept the curved edge through them low down with the other, and laid the cut handful behind, and then bent and reached and swept again, and again, all down the length of the field, hour upon hour, until the back had learned a particular and lasting kind of aid. It was bent, repetitive, unglamorous work, and it was among the most important things the people did in all the year. There was a rhythm to it that a body fell into and could keep for a long while. The soft hiss of the blade, the dry rustle of the falling stalks, the slow shuffle forward. And a good reaper was not the one who tore at the field in bursts, but the one who could hold that quiet rhythm steady from the gray of the morning until the light at last began to fail. Behind the reapers came the binders, often the women and the older children, gathering the cut stalks into armfuls and twisting a few of the stems themselves into a band to tie each bundle into a sheaf. The sheaves were the harvest made into something a person could carry and count and stack, and they were handled almost tenderly, set upright and leaned together into little stooks so that the wind could move through them, and the heads could go on drying there in the open air. Always behind the work, there was the weather. In the damp north, the great enemy of the grain harvest was not the frost, but the rain. The slow gray rain that could settle in for a week and rot a cut crop where it lay. So the people watched the sky even as they worked, reading the cloud and the wind off the sea, and on a day when the air came over with the smell of coming wet, they would drive themselves hard, racing to get the sheaves stooked or carried under cover before the first heavy drops arrived. When a stretch of the field was cut and the sheaves had stood and dried a little, they were carried in. Some farms had a low cart, a simple thing of wood drawn by an ox or a tough little horse. On rougher ground, the sheaves went in on people's backs, bundle after bundle, down the worn path to the yard. There they were stacked, heads turned inward against the wet, into ricks and up into the loft of the barn, the gathered weight of the whole year's bread rising slowly under cover. In so damp a climate, the grain could not simply be stored as it came in. It held too much moisture, and would heat and spoil and grow a gray fur of mold in the dark. So before it was threshed, it had to be dried, spread thin across the loft where the warmth of the hall rose up through the floor, or set near a low and carefully tended fire, turned and turned again until the heads were brittle and the kernels rang hard between the fingers. It was slow, watchful work, for a fire let grow too eager could take the whole crop and the barn together. The threshing was done on the swept floor of the barn, out of the wind. The grain was beaten free of the heads, and the straw with stout wooden staves, brought down on the spread sheaves again and again in a steady, heavy rhythm, the dry stalks jumping a little under each blow. 2 or 3 working together would fall into an overlapping beat, thud after thud after thud, a sound like a slow, dull heart that went on all through the short gray days. Beating the grain free left it mixed with chaff, the light dry husks and the broken bits of head, and to part the two the people used the wind itself. On a breezy day they carried the threshed grain to the open barn door or out into the yard and tossed it up from a broad, shallow basket, and the breeze took the light chaff and carried it off in a pale drifting cloud, while the heavier kernels fell straight back down. They poured it from basket to basket, again and again, until what remained was clean. What was left, at the end of all that bending and beating and tossing, was a heap of clean barley, dull gold and faintly warm to the hand, and it was perhaps the single most valuable thing on the whole farm. It was bread for the long winter, and porridge, and the malt for the ale of the feast days. It was the seed for next year's field, and a thing that could be bartered or owed to a lord. Every basketful stood for days of labor by the whole household, and it was treated accordingly, with care. Before any of it was eaten, the most important portion was set apart and put away untouched, the seed corn for the spring sowing. To eat the seed corn was the last act of a household in despair, the final mortgaging of the future against the hunger of the present, and a careful family guarded against ever coming to it. The best, the plumpest, the soundest grain was sorted into a separate store, sealed and watched, a quiet promise made to the coming year and laid by in the dark. The grain meant for eating still had to be ground, and that was done a little at a time, by hand on the quern. 2 heavy discs of stone lay one upon the other. Grain was fed through a hole in the upper stone, and a woman or a girl turned it by a wooden peg, round and round and round, while the meal sifted out gray and gritty from between them. It was the most constant labor of the whole household, never quite finished, and the low grinding rumble of the quern ran beneath daily life like a pulse. The meal that came from the quern was coarse, and carried always a little grit worn from the stones, so that the people's teeth were ground flat early by their own daily bread. From it the women made the household's food, a stiff barley porridge cooked slow in an iron pot hung over the fire, and flat round loaves baked quickly on a hot stone or an iron griddle at the hearth's edge, unleavened and dense and dark, the plain bread that would carry them all the way through to the spring. Nothing of the harvest was wasted, not even the beaten straw. It was forked up and carried to the byre to be laid down as bedding for the cattle, where it would soak up the winter's dung and become, by spring, the precious manure for the fields. Some went as a thin poor fodder to stretch the hay a little further. Some was kept to mend the thatch, or twisted into rope, or pushed into shoes and bed places against the cold. The grain fed the people, and the straw, in its quieter way, fed almost everything else. When the sheaves were all carried in, the field was not quite finished with. The poorest of the household, and the children, went over it once more, gleaning, gathering the scattered heads the harvest had dropped, a handful here and there that on a tight farm was well worth the bending. Then the geese and the pigs were led out onto the stubble to take what was left of it, and the field, stripped and brown and empty, was given over at last to the coming of the winter. And so the barley was in, the first great weight of the season lifted and stored away under cover. But grain alone does not carry a household through a northern winter. There must be meat as well, and fat, and the long-keeping foods that stand between a family and the hunger of the dark months. So while the threshing went on in the barn, another and a harder labor was already beginning out in the yard, among the animals the family had counted and judged and could not keep. It is to them that we turn now. The animals came down from the high summer pastures as the cold deepened, driven home along the old paths by the young people who had watched over them through the warm months. The cattle came lowing and unhurried, their summer fat upon them, and the sheep and the goats behind. And the farm that had felt half empty all summer filled again with the sound and the smell of the herd, gathered back to the home field to be sorted and judged before the snow shut everything in. The byre that would shelter the kept animals through the winter was made ready, mucked out and swept and laid with fresh straw, for the beasts would spend the long dark months under the same roofline as the people, their warmth rising to help heat the hall and their breath fogging in the dim light. To house an animal through the winter was a serious promise of fodder, and only those the household had judged it could feed would be granted a place there in the dark and the straw. The choosing was done with a cool and practiced eye. The best breeding stock was kept, the cows in calf, the strong young ewes, the ram and the bull that would father the next year's increase. These were the living seed of the herd, as precious in their way as the seed corn in the chest, and they were marked to be carried through. The old, the barren, the surplus young, and any beast too weak to be worth its winter fodder were set, quietly, into the other group. For the animals that could not be kept, the autumn was the appointed time. There was no sentiment in it, but neither was there any cruelty. It was simply the oldest of the household's hard necessities, the turning of a living animal into the food and the fat and the leather that would carry the family through to the spring. The people who did this work had raised the beasts and knew them, and they did the thing plainly and without waste, as something that had always been done and always would be. And so the work was done, in the cold of the early day, quietly and with care, and the yard that had been loud with the gathered herd grew slowly stiller as the autumn went on. What had been an animal became, under the patient hands of the household, the makings of a winter, the meat to be preserved, the fat to be rendered, the blood to be caught and used, the hide and the horn and the bone and the sinew, each of which had its own destiny in the long economy of the farm. The governing rule of all of it was that nothing be wasted. A household this far north, with the winter coming on, could not afford to throw away any part of so dear a thing as a slaughtered beast, and so every portion was turned to use. The meat was the prize, but the fat was nearly its equal, and the blood and the offal were food in their own right, and even the parts that could not be eaten became tools, or thread, or leather, or were given to the dogs and the pigs. Frugality here was not meanness, it was survival made into a habit. Salt, which would have been the simplest way to keep the meat, was in the north a scarce and costly thing. There were no great salt beds here as there were in warmer lands. What salt the people had was won laboriously by boiling seawater down over a fire, or by burning seaweed and leaching the ash, until a little gray precious crust was left behind. Because it cost so much labor, salt was used sparingly, and the household leaned far more on the older, cheaper magic of smoke and cold air and time. What salting was done was careful and deliberate. Pieces of meat were rubbed with the gray salt and packed close into wooden barrels and tubs, layer upon layer, pressed down and sealed against the air, to lie in their own brine through the months ahead. A barrel of salt meat was a kind of stored safety, a thing that could be opened in the deepest part of the winter when nothing fresh remained, and the household packed it slowly and well, knowing what it might one day be worth to them. But the greater part of the keeping was done with fire and smoke, and so the work drew inward now, to the hearth at the heart of the hall. First the fat was rendered. The hard suet and the trimmed fat were cut small and set in an iron pot over a low and steady fire, where they melted slowly down through a long afternoon into clear golden tallow, the kitchen filling with a heavy, homely smell while a child was set to stir it and keep it from catching. The tallow that came of it was almost as useful as the meat. Poured off and left to set pale and firm in pots, it was food, stirred into porridge and spread on bread to carry a body through the cold. It was fuel, burned in the little soapstone lamps that gave the hall its small flames against the dark. It was a grease to soften leather and seal wood and protect iron from the rust. A household could never have too much of it, and the autumn was the one season it could be laid by in quantity. The meat that was not salted was hung up to be cured in the smoke of the hearth. In the rafters above the fire, where the wood smoke gathered thick and warm before it found the hole in the ridge, the people hung joints and strips of meat and let them slowly darken and dry over days and weeks, the smoke driving out the damp and laying down its own faint preserving bitterness. Looking up into the smoke dark of the roof, one could read the coming winter's larder hanging there, curing slowly in the gloom. Even the blood was kept and made into food, mixed with grain and fat, and a little of the precious flavoring herbs, packed into cleaned guts or a stomach and gently cooked into dark, dense puddings that could be kept and sliced through the weeks ahead. It was a thrifty, nourishing food, made at no extra cost out of what would otherwise be lost. And the smell of it cooking, rich and dark over the fire, was one of the smells that meant the autumn work was truly underway. Through these few weeks, by a strange turn, the household ate well. The parts of the animal that could not be kept, the fresh offal and the cuts that would not cure, had to be eaten while they were good, and so the autumn of scarcity was also, briefly, an autumn of plenty, the one stretch of the year when fresh meat came often to the board. They ate it gladly and without guilt, knowing the lean months were coming, taking what the season gave before the long discipline of the winter store began. The hides were not forgotten in any of this. Scraped clean of flesh and fat and stretched on wooden frames to dry, or set to soak and soften in pits with bark and other steeped things to cure them, they would become the leather the household lived in. The shoes, the belts, the straps and harness, the covers and the bags, the tough skin that bound 100 small things together. Tanning was slow and patient and not sweet to the nose, and it went on quietly at the edge of the yard through the whole season. What was left after the meat and the fat and the hide still had its uses. The horns were cleaned to become cups and spoons and the little containers in which small things were kept. The larger bones were worked into combs and pins and skates, and the smooth tools of the textile work. The sinew was dried and split into a strong thread that would stitch leather and bind hafts. A patient household let almost nothing fall to true waste, and the long winter evenings ahead would be filled with the quiet shaping of these things. By the time this work was done, the byre held only the chosen animals, settled into their winter stalls, and the rest had been transformed, wholly and without waste, into the stores that would feed the household through the dark. The herd was smaller now, and quieter, and the farm had taken one more long step toward being ready. But meat and fat were not the whole of the winter larder. The grey water beyond the home field had its own harvest to give, and to the shore and the fishing we will go next. The grey water beyond the home field was not only a road and a danger, it was a larder, and in the autumn it gave generously. As the meat work went on in the yard, the men and the older boys turned to the shore, for this was the season when the fish came close and thick, and a household that filled its racks and barrels with the catch of these weeks added another solid wall against the hunger of the winter. The cold was rising, but so, for a little while, was the bounty of the deep. Some of the catch came in great silver runs. The herring that moved along the coast in their season in numbers almost past believing, so that a net set across their path came up heavy and shining, and a few good days could fill more barrels than a family could pack. The work was cold and wet, the hands raw with brine, the small boat rising and falling on the grey swell. But every fish was winter food, and so it was done gladly, while the run lasted and the weather held. Other fish were taken one by one, on lines weighted with stone and baited and let down into the deep cold water off the headland, where the cod hung heavy in the dark below. It was patient work, drifting in the small boat through the short day, hauling the wet line hand over hand when a fish took, and it asked a knowledge of the water that was passed down without being taught, where the fish lay, how the tide ran, when the sky meant a man should already be turning for home. Ashore, the fish were made ready to keep. The cod were split open along the spine and gutted and cleaned, and then, Needing little or no salt, they were hung in pairs over the long wooden drying racks that stood near the shore, where the cold autumn wind would do the rest. Hung up in their thousands, swaying and stiffening in the salt air, they would dry over the weeks into hard, light, lasting stockfish that could be stored almost without limit and softened again in water when the winter needed them. The herring, oilier and quicker to spoil, were dealt with faster, gutted and layered with what salt could be spared into barrels, or strung up to smoke a while in the hearth with the meat. Whatever the method, the principle was the same as everywhere else in these weeks. Take the brief, cold abundance the season offered and lock it away in a form that would still be food when the racks stood empty and the boats lay drawn up under snow and the water gave nothing at all. Dried and salted and smoked, the fish became one of the quiet foundations of the winter diet, a steady plain protein that could be carried, traded, and counted on long after the fresh meat of the autumn slaughter was gone. A loft hung with stockfish and a row of herring barrels in the cool store was a kind of wealth that needed no guarding but the roof over it, and the household added to it day by day for as long as the season would allow. Indoors, the women turned the last of the summer's milk into things that would keep. The cows would soon go dry as the grass failed, and these final weeks of milking were the year's last chance to lay by the rich foods of the dairy. Nothing of the milk was let go to waste. The cream was lifted for butter, the curds set for cheese, the soured milk thickened into the dense, tart skyr that the people prized, and even the thin whey left at the end was kept, for it had its own slow magic of preservation. Butter was made by the long, rhythmic labor of the churn. The cream worked up and down with a wooden plunger, on and on through an arm-aching stretch of the morning, until at last the fat broke and gathered into soft, pale lumps in the buttermilk. It was patient, almost trance-like work, often given to a girl or an older woman who could keep the slow beat steady while her thoughts went elsewhere. The dull knock of the plunger, another of the household sounds that marked the passing of the autumn days. The butter, salted a little where salt allowed, was packed firm into wooden tubs and casks for the winter, and some households kept it in the coldest and strangest of stores, sunk in a chest down into the cool, wet peat of a bog, where the airless cold could hold its sound for a very long time. Buried so, away from heat and light and air, a store of butter became a deep reserve against the leanest months, a hidden richness waiting under the moss for the day it was needed. The cheeses were pressed and set on shelves to age, firm and plain, and the skyr was crocked and stored cool, and the household's autumn dairy slowly took the shape of a wall of pots and tubs along the dim store. These foods were dense and lasting and full of the goodness of the green summer the cows had eaten. Summer itself folded away into a form that could be carried across the dark, so that even in the deepest cold there would be a little of the warm season left to taste. Beyond the field and the shore, the autumn land itself was foraged over for its last free gifts. The women and the children went out to the heath and the woods to gather what grew wild and would keep, the small tart berries of the moor, the lingonberries and the bilberries, and the amber cloudberries from the boggy ground, the bright hips of the wild rose, all of which could be dried or steeped or mixed with honey into stores that brought a little sharpness and sweetness to the plain winter food. From the woods came hazelnuts to be gathered up and dried and kept in their hard shells, a good food that needed almost no tending to last the winter. And from the moor and the riverbank came roots and wild greens, angelica and the rest, to be dried or stored. The berries were spread on cloths and boards near the hearth or in the airy loft to lose their water and shrink down small in keeping, and the sharp green smell of them drying was folded in among the smoke and the salt. Even the edge of the water gave food to those who knew how to take it. At the low tide, the people gathered certain seaweeds from the rocks, to be dried and eaten through the winter, and shellfish from the cold mud, and the eggs and down of the season where the birds allowed, small harvests, each one, But a household this far north counted nothing too small to be worth the gathering, and every dried handful was one more day's eating laid by against the dark. All of this, the grain and the meat, the fat and the fish, the butter and the cheese and the dried wild things, came at last to the store, the raised wooden house set up on its stones so that the rats and the damp could not easily reach the food within. Day by day through the autumn it filled, the sacks and the barrels and the hanging things crowding closer, until to step inside and breathe the dim, cool smell of it was to feel, in the gut, the difference between fear and a kind of quiet safety. Some foods went down instead into pits dug in the cool earth, sealed over against the frost, and others into the deep barrels that lined the walls, each sealed and marked in the keeper's memory. And over all of it the woman of the house held her quiet reckoning, knowing without writing it down how much of each thing there was and how long it must last, dividing the winter in her mind into the weeks it would have to feed, so that the store was not eaten too fast and the spring not met with empty shelves. With the store filling and the food made safe, the most pressing of the autumn fears began to ease, and the household could turn some of its attention from the gathering of food to the other work of getting ready, the making and the mending that would clothe and warm and shelter them through the months indoors. For the winter was not only a thing to be eaten through, it was a thing to be sat through in the cold and the dark, and there was much still to prepare for that long sitting. Food would keep a household alive through the winter, but it was wool that would keep it warm, and the long, slow work of turning a fleece into cloth was as much a part of the autumn as the harvest itself. The sheep had been sheared back in the warmth of the early summer, and now the stored fleeces were brought out, and the women and the girls settled to the unending labor of comb and spindle and loom that would clothe the whole household against the cold to come. First the wool was cleaned of its worst dirt, and then combed, drawn again and again through the long iron teeth of the wool combs until the tangled fibers lay straight and fine and parallel, ready to be drawn out into thread. The combing pulled the wool into soft, airy lengths and left the short, coarse fibers behind, and it filled the dim room with floating motes and the faint animal smell of the fleece, a smell that meant the indoor season of the year had truly begun. Then came the spinning, done not on any wheel, for the wheel had not yet reached the north, but on the simple spindle, a slender stick weighted at the end with a disc of stone or clay. The spinner drew the combed wool from a distaff held in the crook of her arm, set the spindle turning with a flick of her fingers, and let it hang and spin and twist the loose fibers into a strong, even thread as it dropped, winding the made yarn on as she went. A practiced woman spun almost without looking, her hands knowing the work while her mind wandered free. The spun yarn was woven into cloth on the great upright loom that stood against the wall of the hall, a tall wooden frame from which the warp threads hung straight down, held taut by rows of fired clay and stone weights that swung and clicked softly when the work was touched. The weaver stood to her loom, passing the weft across and beating it up with a sword-shaped beater, building the cloth slowly downward from the top, and a length of good cloth was the labor of many quiet standing days. The cloth that came off the loom was the plain, strong woolen weave the people lived in, dense and warm and a little rough, in the muted natural colors of the sheep, the browns and grays and creams, deepened here and there with the dull dyes that could be coaxed from plants and lichens. It was cut and sewn into the tunics and cloaks and hoods and wrappings that everyone wore, and a well-stocked chest of it was a real and recognized wealth, as good as silver in a pinch and far warmer in the dark. Much of the autumn's textile work, though, was not making new cloth but saving the old. Worn tunics were patched, thin places strengthened, torn cloaks turned and re-sewn, the winter clothes brought out of the chests and gone over carefully by the light of the lamp, so that nothing came to the cold months with a hole in it. A garment was too dear in labor to be thrown away while a single year's wear remained in it, and the mending went on, stitch by patient stitch, through the lengthening evenings. For the hands and the feet there was another craft, older than knitting, and worked with a single bone needle, in which the wool was looped and drawn through itself again and again to make a dense, warm, close fabric that would not unravel. From it came the mittens and the socks and the snug caps that stood between bare skin and the frost, made in the evenings by firelight from odds and ends of yarn, small things that a winter in the north made into the difference between comfort and a kind of constant low suffering. While the wool work went on indoors, the men were laying in the other great necessity of the winter, the fuel. A northern winter was long and bitterly cold, and a household that ran short of fuel before the spring was in as much danger as one that ran short of food. The fire could not be allowed to go out. So the woodpile, growing day by day against the wall of the hall, was watched and added to with the same anxious care as the food store, for it too was a measure of how the family would live, or merely endure. Where there were trees, the autumn rang with the slow, dull music of the axe, the felling and the cutting to length and the splitting of the rounds, and then the long, careful stacking, bark side up against the rain, in piles that had to be left to season and dry if they were to burn well and not merely smoke and hiss. Splitting wood was a satisfying labor. The clean having of a round under a true blow and the rising woodpile gave back a plain visible reassurance that little else in the season could match. Where trees were few, as on the bare windswept islands and coasts, the people burned the earth itself, cutting blocks of peat from the bog through the year and stacking them in airy heaps to dry, dark, spongy bricks that smoldered slow and warm and filled a hall with their own particular sweet, acrid smoke. Wood or peat, the principle held: gather the fuel while it could be gathered, dry it well, and stack it high, for a cold hearth in the deep of a northern winter was a thing to be feared. The buildings themselves were made ready for the siege of the winter. The turf of the roof was checked and patched where it had thinned, fresh sods laid and tamped down so the rain and the snowmelt would run off and not soak through. The gaps in the timber and the turf walls were stuffed with moss and packed with earth. And the small wind-eyes high under the roof, the only openings that let in light, were fitted with their shutters of wood or stretched membrane, ready to be closed against the storms. The boat, which through the warm months had been the family's road and tool and freedom, was brought up out of the reach of the winter storms. Hauled on rollers up the shingle and into its low shed of stone and turf, or turned over on trestles under cover, it was looked over for the season ahead. The seams checked, the worn ropes set aside, the sail taken down to be dried and mended. A boat left to the winter weather would rot and split. Cared for, it would carry the family out again when the light returned. Down at the edge of the wood, the slow fires of the tar burners smoldered, for the resinous pine was heaped and covered and burned without flame in earthen pits until it wept out its dark, sticky tar, the black blood of the forest that sealed and waterproofed the boats and the ropes and the wood against the wet. The thick smell of it hung over that corner of the farm, and a stock of tar laid by was one more of the small, unglamorous necessities that let a household keep its gear sound through another hard year. Indoors, the nets and the sails were spread and mended, every broken mesh knotted up again, and every worn seam restitched, and the harness and the straps and the tools were gone over one by one. The iron things that had dulled or cracked through the year's work were carried to the smith, who in these weeks brought his cold forge back to life to mend a sickle's edge or weld a broken hinge, the ring of his hammer carrying across the yard in the still autumn air, one more sound of a household setting itself in order. And as these tasks were finished off one by one, the work of the autumn began, at last to slacken. The grain was in and ground, the meat was salted and smoked, the fish hung dry, the dairy crocked, the wool turning into cloth, the woodpile high, the roof sound, the boat sheltered. The farm had drawn itself in and made itself ready, and there came a day when the household looked around at all it had done and understood that the great preparation was very nearly complete. There was one thing left to do before the household gave itself over to the dark, and it was not a labor but a gathering, a marking of the threshold they had reached. For the winter nights had come round at last, the hinge of the year, And on such an evening a farm that had worked so long and so hard would pause and light its fires high and turn for a night from the getting of the winter's food to the older business of facing the winter itself. Let us go into that evening now. For days beforehand, the ale had been working. Some of the precious barley had been wetted and left to sprout, and then dried and crushed into malt, and steeped in warm water, and set to ferment in the great vat, until the hall carried under all its other smells the warm, sour, sweet breath of the brewing. Ale was the drink of every feast and every gathering in the north, and no marking of the winter nights could happen without it, and so the brewing had been tended as carefully as any other work of the season. On the evening itself the hall was made ready, as it was made ready only a few times in the year. The fires were built up higher than the careful daily flame. The soapstone lamps were all of them lit and set along the walls. The floor was freshly strewn, and the long benches were cleared and covered for the gathering. The dim, smoky room that held the household through its ordinary days was warmed and brightened into something like a held breath, waiting, the cold shut out beyond the turf and the dark, and there was food, more and richer than on any ordinary night. Some of the fresh meat of the slaughter, roasted and stewed, was brought to the board with the new dark bread and the fresh butter and the soft cheeses, the dried berries and the honey set out in their dishes, the ale poured foaming from the vat into the horns and the wooden cups. After the long anxious weeks of saving and storing, the household ate openly and well, a deliberate single night of plenty laid against the lean months it knew were coming. The household gathered all of it, the master and the mistress, the children, the old ones who remembered other winters, the farmhands and the unfree who had labored through the harvest beside the rest. Sometimes a neighbor came too, across the dark from the next steading, for the winter nights were a time of guesting and of binding the scattered households of a district a little closer before the snow cut the paths and shut each farm into itself for the long months ahead. The winter nights were not only a feast, they were a threshold, and the people understood them as such. This was the night the old half of the bright year ended, and the dark half began, and to cross such a hinge in the turning of the world was a thing that asked for more than eating and drinking. It asked for thanks for what had been gathered in, and for a quiet plea that the household and its herd might be carried safely through to the far side of the cold. And so, amid the warmth, there was also a turning toward the unseen. The observance of these autumn nights was given especially to the Disir, the company of guardian spirits and ancestral mothers whom the household held close, the unseen women of the family's own past, who were thought to watch over its fortune and its fields. A portion of the feast and a pouring of the ale were offered to them, and to the spirits of the land and the dead beneath it, in thanks for the year's increase and in hope of their protection through the dark. The living household and its unseen kin gathered for a moment at one hearth. The cup went round the gathering then, passed hand to hand along the benches, and as it went the people spoke, some aloud and some only in themselves, words of thanks for those who had come through the year, and words of remembering for those who had not. The names of the dead spoken softly into the fire-lit warmth, so that they were not let slip entirely into the dark. It was a gentle thing, this remembering, neither grim nor merry, the simple holding together of a family across the line of the living and the gone. And then, as the fire settled and the ale warmed the room, the talk turned to stories, as it always did. The old ones told the long tales they had told before and would tell again, of other winters and older families, of the spirits of the place and the doings of gods who were half believed and wholly enjoyed. The words rising and falling in the firelight, while the children leaned against the warm bodies of the grown and let their eyes grow heavy, and the room blur softly around them. Outside, the wind came off the fjord and leaned on the hall as it had all autumn, and the cold pressed against the turf, and somewhere out in the dark the first true snows of the winter were perhaps already gathering, but none of it could get in. Inside there was firelight and full bellies, and the low murmur of familiar voices, and the smell of ale and smoke and roasted meat. And for this one night the household sat in the small warm center it had worked so hard to build, and let the great dark wait at the door. One by one, the children were carried off to the sleeping places along the wall and tucked under the woolen covers and the warm fleeces, already half dreaming, and the talk among the grown ones grew lower and slower and more comfortable. The long day and the long season and the strong ale all working together now to soften the edges of the room. The feast did not end so much as it gradually came to rest, sinking by degrees toward sleep as the fire sank toward its embers. In the mocking of the winter nights, the household had done the last and the oldest of its preparations. It had filled its store against the hunger of the body, and now it had gathered at its fire to make ready the spirit as well, to give its thanks and ask its protection and remind itself, in the warm circle of the living and the remembered, that it would face the coming dark together and not alone. There was nothing left now to prepare. There was only the winter and the waiting through it. And so we come, with the household, to the far quiet end of the autumn, when all the labor is finished and there is nothing more to do but rest. Let the voices fade now, and the last of the feast settle into stillness, and let us stay on a little while in the warm, dim hall as the fire burns down and the steading sinks slowly towards sleep around us. The hard work of getting ready is over. What remains is only the long, soft drift into the winter dark and into rest. The fire is banked now, low and soft, raked over and covered with ash so that its heart will keep, glowing slow and red through the long night and into the morning, when it will be coaxed up again into flame. There is no need to feed it more. It only has to last, the way everything in this season has been made to last, and so it settles and glows and breathes its faint warmth out into the dim and quieting hall. All around the dim hall the household sleeps, wrapped in the wool it carded and spun and wove through the autumn evenings, warm under the fleeces, breathing slow in the dark. The day's long work has let go of them at last, and the season's longer work as well. And there is nothing now that any of them needs to do, nothing to watch for, nothing to finish. They have made themselves ready, and the readiness holds them now, gently, the way the banked fire holds its heat. Outside, the wind comes off the water, as it has come all the long autumn, and leans on the turf walls, and finds the seams of the roof, and speaks low in the timbers. But the moss is packed in the gaps now, and the sods are sound overhead, and the cold cannot get in. The wind may lean and search and murmur all it likes. It will not reach the sleepers. It only circles the warm, dark hall, and passes on, and circles back, and passes on again. In the byre under the same long roof, the chosen animals stand and lie in the straw, the cattle and the sheep that were judged worth their winter fodder, breathing their slow, warm breath into the dark, shifting now and then, settling again. They too are part of the readiness. They too will be carried through. And their warmth rises into the hall above and mingles with the warmth of the banked fire and helps to hold the cold a little further off through the night. And in the dark of the store, beyond the sleeping hall, all the gathered work of the autumn waits in its barrels and its sacks and its hanging rows. The barley, ground and whole, the salt meat in its brine, the fish gone hard and light on their strings, the butter sunk cold in the bog, and the cheeses on their shelves. The dried berries, the nuts, the tallow set pale in its pots. It is all there, in the cool and the dark, exactly as it was left, waiting quietly to be needed. Perhaps, somewhere out in the night, the first real snow of the winter has begun, drifting down soft and slow over the brown-stripped field and the empty drying racks and the sound turf roof, settling without a sound, gathering on the still ground. It does not matter now. The harvest is in, the fire is banked, the store is full. Let the snow come down as it will, all through the dark. There is nothing left out there that the cold can take. There is a deep and particular peace in this. The peace of work that is finished, of a thing long feared and long prepared for that has at last been met. All through the shortening days, the household carried the weight of the coming winter in the back of its mind, the long arithmetic, the watching of the sky, the racing of the weather. And now the weight is set down. The winter may come. It is welcome to come. The farm is ready, and the people can rest. And the fire glows on, low and red and patient. The way it has been made to glow, the way the whole steading has been made to wait. The wind leans on the hall and passes on. The animals breathe in the straw. The store keeps its dark abundance. The snow comes down, soft and slow and silent, over a world that has made itself ready. And the people sleep, warm in the wool of their own long work, while the year turns quietly past its hinge and into the dark. If you are still awake, there is nothing you need to keep hold of. The names have gone past like the smoke through the rafters, and they do not need to stay. The work is done, in the hall and in the story both. You may let the dim, warm room blur and soften and slip away, the fire fading to a far red point, the wind growing distant, the slow breathing of the sleeping household becoming, by degrees, your own. Outside, the long northern winter is only just beginning, and it will be dark and cold and very long. But that is for the morning, and the many mornings after it. For now there is only this, the banked fire, glowing low, the wind, leaning soft on the turf, the warmth held close against the dark. The whole steading at rest, gathered in, made ready, asleep. And nothing, anywhere, that still needs to be done. Sleep now, if you have not already, as the household sleeps, as the fire sleeps under its ash, as the snow lays itself down over the quiet field. The long preparation is over. The store is full and the roof is sound, and the fire will keep till morning. There is nothing more to gather, nothing more to mend, nothing more to fear. Only the soft red glow, and the soft falling snow, and the long warm dark going on, and on, and on. The fire glows low, the wind leans soft and passes on, the snow comes down, the steading sleeps, and the long winter night settles over the old north, gentle and complete, and holds it all, the people and the animals and the gathered stores, safe and still and warm in the dark, until the slow far-off return of the light. Rest well, sleep well. The archive will be here, glowing quietly, when you wake.
You've reached the end of tonight's archive. If you're still awake, thank you for staying. And if you drifted off somewhere in the dark, then it did its work. Rest now. The next chapter will be here when you are. Sleep well. This has been Archive Whispers.